Let's turn to this story now. The chimney that will signal the outcome of the papal election has been installed atop the Sistine Chapel. Vatican workers hoisted it into place ahead of the conclave, where cardinals will gather to elect a successor to Pope Francis by secret ballot. Now, throughout history, these gatherings have marked turning points for the Catholic Church as each newly elected pope shapes the direction of the institution. Only cardinals under the age of 80 are eligible to vote, a process considered both a solemn duty and a spiritual responsibility. To discuss what this moment could mean for the global Catholic community, I'm joined now by Lance Thomas, Project Manager at the Center for Faith and Community in the Faculty of Theology and Religion at the University of Pretoria. Lance, good to have you. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. Let's start firstly at the name itself, conclave. I believe it's Latin for with a key. What does it really mean?
Well, so good that we start with that. Good evening, Thabo, and good evening to your viewers at home and to your staff in the studio this evening. So you're correct. Conclave is from the Latin conclave, with a key. And I suppose its tradition starts almost 800 years ago. For the first few hundred years of papal elections, very often it went through different incarnations. Initially, it was a handing on from one bishop of Rome to the next, and eventually it became a very political movement. It moved out of the hands of ordinary people who elected a pope. It moved towards kings electing popes, and eventually it moved back to churches, church leaders electing the popes. But because it's such a contentious position, a very powerful position, currently the Pope is head of almost 1.4 billion Catholics. So to pick the right Pope, or to have a Pope in your corner, to use a more contemporary term, meant that you wielded quite a lot of power. You wielded the future direction both of civil society, but also of the religious state. So very often these debates took very, very long. Cardinals were locked in deadlocks, trying to ensure that their own person come to the fore. And eventually, the city mayor in Italy just got so frustrated with this long process. I think it was in the early 1300s, where it took 3 years to elect a new pope, and they decided they're just going to lock the cardinals into a room, take off the roof of the church, and reduce their food rations so that to force them to elect a pope. And so from that, soon after that, the space moved to the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican. And once the conclave starts, the cardinal in charge of the voting would order everybody out of the Sistine Chapel and then shut the doors. It would lock the doors. And I think the conclave comes from that action of locking the doors, of sealing the Sistine Chapel, in order to ensure that nothing goes in, nothing comes out, and that the election process for the future pope is something done in secrecy, and that there's also an urgency in the cardinals trying to figure out who the next pope would be.
So with those two words, extra omnes, or all out, everybody gets out except what we are talking about now, the 130 that are below the age of 80. Why is that important that they are below the age of 80?
I suppose it's just a biological thing. Over the age of 80, sometimes we're not so compos mentis. So to ensure that, because it's such an important process, such an important role within the church, we want to make sure that all the cardinals have all their faculties firstly, but also as we age, our ability to be able to be in a locked room for an extended period of time, the abilities of cardinals to be able to go in every day into the Sistine Chapel, to come out, and just the rigor of the whole process. I think it's an act of compassion as well, that one of the popes just decided that 80 should be a cutoff. Let's use, I know 80 is quite an extensive age, but let's use people under the age of 80. that would then elect a pope.
How will it work? I believe the 7th of May, that afternoon, is when it all begins. You've got these 130 cardinals, or college of cardinals that is there. Does it work almost like a jury system? Do they influence each other, or is it just a secret ballot? Everybody just votes the many times that it goes?
So the first day of the conclave, they start off with a mass, because it's a reminder that this is not a political act, it's more a spiritual act, because he would be, even though he is head of the Vatican state and therefore a political leader, that he is also a spiritual leader of Catholics right around the world. So they start off with a mass on the first day, and the cardinals are introduced to one another. So in previous years, most of the cardinals lived and worked in the Vatican, because they were obviously the ones who would elect the next pope. But due to improved transport, improved communications, cardinals now are found throughout the world in their various roles and functions, and very often in their own diocese. So the cardinals don't always know each other as well as they used to in previous years. So the first day is basically presenting candidates, saying why you think a certain cardinal should be the next pope. But once the election starts, the election is done on a secret ballot, and there are then three counters. The first one will read it, pass it to the second one, will also read the name on the slip as they take it out of the secret ballot, and the third one will announce it and put it onto a little needle, through a needle and string, and this will then show that the number has been counted. And once all the ballots have been put on the string and all the cardinals' votes have been counted, if there isn't a 2/3 majority, which is the bare minimum required for Pope, then the ballots are burnt. And this is the black smoke and the white smoke that you introduced the story with. That if a Pope is chosen, if a Pope is not chosen, there's not a 2/3 majority. They take the ballots, they burn it with some straw, and traditionally they used to wet the straw, and the straw used to burn black to show that there's no Pope. If there was a Pope elected, they would then burn the straw dry, which would make white smoke. But people found it very difficult to see the color always. So in more contemporary times, that added a chemical to make sure that people could see it was black or white, and even that didn't help. So very recently, as recent as 2006, they decided to also ring the bells so that people were not left doubtful as to whether a pope was elected or not.
Now, you've mentioned also there's mass that is a part of this process, because they believe there is divine intervention. There's the Holy Spirit actually that intervenes in the election of this Pope. How to explain to that for people who might not really understand that concept? How will you know that this is a Pope elected of the Holy Spirit?
If we look at the history of the church, it might not always seem that. I think Joseph Ratzinger, the previous Pope Benedict XVI was Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger before, summarized it quite nicely. He always said that you know that the Pope might not be perfect, but he is the right person for the time. And very often we see that unfolding as the Pope fits into his role. And very often the popes tend to be very different from its predecessor. So we go by faith. We know that somehow this Holy Spirit is in the background. And when we studied theology back in the day, they always say God draws straight with crooked lines. So as flawed as the popes might seem to our ordinary eyes, our contemporary eyes, when we look at the history of the papacy, when we look at the fact that after 2,000 years, despite some of the popes that were elected, that the church still stands, we have to believe that there is divine intervention somewhere in the background. If we look at the scandals that the Catholic Church has gone through, the scandals the popes themselves have created, we as people of faith somehow say, well, somehow the hand of God is still present in the church, still guiding the church. And so that's why we ensure that, as flawed as we are in our own choices, that we do hold a certain amount of trust of the elections, and we place that into the belief that the Holy Spirit is present in the action.
Conclave after conclave, I mean, if you were to look, maybe let's take it a little bit closer from 1996, St. Paul rewrote the regulations on the papal election. What are some of the major differences that you would have seen in the papacy of each pope that would have come in?
So, Pope John Paul II, who you say rewrote some of he tried to shift it from a 2/3 majority just to a simple majority, because he himself was part of a conclave that just didn't want to end because they couldn't get a 2/3 majority. But I mean, his papacy has really defined the church for contemporary times. He was one of the first few popes after the Second Vatican Council, which called the Pope into the modern era. Many Catholics were a little bit hesitant about the Second Vatican Council, or some thinking even it's heretical because it changed the Latin language. It made contemporary language. People could celebrate Mass in a language that they knew. And many people felt very uneasy with this. And I think John Paul II, in the type of Pope that he was, brought a type of calmness to many people. So he was an extremely conservative Pope, trying to figure out, trying to balance the reforms of Vatican II with the space in which ordinary Catholics found themselves. And he was quite a great, I think, in many ways, builder between the more conservative and trying to just slow down the pace of reform of Vatican II to ensure that as many Catholics as possible could understand what those reforms meant. Benedict XVI, who succeeded him, was, I suppose, they used to call him the John Paul's bulldog. All the papal decrees that John Paul made, Benedict XVI used to theologize and promulgate and argue the points that people could understand. But his papacy, I think, was really significantly different to what I would have expected with this great theologian. His first encyclical is Deus Caritas Est, God is Love. And so from a great theologian that most people know him to have been, to go back to the fact, John Paul is very much a philosophical pope. He's definitely the philosopher pope. Benedict XVI is very much a theologian pope, but reminding us that despite all this ideas of God and who God is not, that ultimately God is still love. God is still a God who draws himself closer to us. And he had, coming from somebody like Benedict XVI, I think, calmed the church down in quite a considerable way. And then also his abdication, his resignation from the papacy, set the church on a whole new trajectory. We asked ourselves as Catholics new questions about the authority of the Pope and the role of the Pope, and just what the Pope means to our society. And for me, one of the greatest things that Joseph Ratzinger said, or Benedict XVI said, is that he didn't feel he was the Pope for the time. So despite the Holy Spirit, he believed very firmly the Holy Spirit calling him and electing him. He felt that his conservatism was maybe holding the church too far back, and that the church needed new blood, new reform. It needed Vatican II to be implemented. And then we have obviously the Pope that just passed away, Pope Francis, who in many ways broke quite a few traditional Catholic norms. He's the first Jesuit Pope, and in Catholic tradition, because of the role of the Jesuits in the church, the Jesuit general was always known as the Black Pope. And there was always a fear of electing a Jesuit as Pope because the Jesuits really are strong reformers, always taking the church forward. And they felt to have the Jesuits and a Jesuit Pope might take the church too fast forward. A second component that Francis broke was that many said that the Pope should not really take the name Francis because Saint Francis, the patron saint of the poor, and the Pope cannot really be poor in the sense that Francis was. And so in Pope Francis, he breaks that mold. He takes the Jesuit reform forward, but says that the church is also the church of the poor. and so that these traditional norms, these statements of church hierarchies that aren't legislated necessarily, but just tradition, he proves himself as a transformer of tradition, a moving forward away from tradition into a church that is very much more relevant in contemporary society. So for me, those are the last three popes that I thought I'd share with your listeners.
Lance, let's take that last part. I mean, the chosen name, the chosen papal name. How is that process conceived? How does it come about?
Okay, so the popes normally choose the names themselves as an indication to the general populace, the Catholic faithful, of the type of pope that they would like to be. So when Pope Francis chooses Francis, there are quite a lot of indications as to the type of pope he wants to be. So Saint Francis is the patron saint of fraternity, of universal brotherhood and sisterhood. So his document Fratelli Tutti focuses on that we are all brothers and sisters. Saint Francis is also the patron saint of ecology, of the environment, and so Laudato Si is already a pre-thought in Pope Francis's mind that the care for the environment, eco-theology, a standing against corporate greed and the destruction of our environment is something important for him. And obviously, by choosing the name of Francis, because Francis also, as I said, the patron saint of the poor, that he aligns himself with the vulnerable of society. Obviously, a statement against global capitalism, a statement against consumption. Those are all prefigured in the name that he's chosen. So, as a Franciscan myself, I was quite excited just to hear that component, the choice, the spirituality. It really resonated quite a lot with me, and I think with a lot of people that are worried about the most vulnerable in contemporary society, where possessions, power, privilege is such a loud voice in our society. To have somebody choose exactly the opposite, to stand as a beacon, as an icon, in opposition to this power narratives that we find.
We appreciate your time, Lance. Thanks for that intervention, quite enlightening. Thank you very much for coming on. That's Lance Thomas, Project Manager at the Center for Faith and Community in the Faculty of Theology and Religion at the University of Pretoria.